Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
The defense spending debate in Canada has changed a great deal since this time last year. A Liberal Party leadership race and subsequent federal election saw a new consensus form around increased defense spending by 2030, only to have the Prime Minister make a landmark announcement in June 2025 that Canada would spend the equivalent of 2% of GDP on defense within the fiscal year. Only weeks later, Canada signed on to the Hague Declaration alongside NATO allies, committing to increase core defense spending to 3.5% by 2035 and an additional 1.5% in defense and security-related expenditures. This marks a substantial shift in the ambition of peacetime defense policy in Canada, and also reinforces the international emphasis on percentage of GDP measurements of defense spending. Our guest today is Dr. Anessa Kimball, full professor of international relations at Université Laval, a fellow here at the CIDP, and one of the country's leading experts on defense spending and burden sharing. Welcome, Dr. Kimball.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
To provide a bit of background for our listeners on this issue area, would you be able to explain why NATO has focused on establishing a common minimum threshold for defense spending?
Well, you can think about it in a couple ways. So first off, we tend to kind of characterize this as saying it's new. It's really not that new. Thinking about contributions and how countries contribute to the collective security of the alliance, and even the GDP metric goes all the way back to the 1980s when Spain was joining NATO. And so at that point, it was essentially trying to understand trying to get an idea with what could be a Spanish contribution while also not burdening the economy too much. And so this, kind of discussion obviously reemerged at the end of the Cold War. And so at the end of the Cold War, we had many countries which joined the Partnership for Peace, which was basically the institution that intended to kind of help countries understand what NATO is about, learn about NATO's practices, but also essentially enter the organization if they want to. And so at that moment, as you can imagine, it was kind of a very complicated bargaining game, right? You have all of these various countries, post-communist countries that are now free. They're pursuing market reforms. They're pursuing democracy. But the idea was essentially, how can we ensure these countries spend enough on defense to be able to protect themselves, but also contribute some to the organization? Because at the end of the day, of course, the idea would be NATO would be having missions. And of course, it goes all the way back to like the late 1990s when the U.S. government essentially started, the Congressional Budget Research Office started doing simulations on these small-sized economies to understand, okay, what would be an appropriate level of spending, to kind of generate these, and of course, as they were undergoing market reforms, we believe their economies would become more vibrant, right? And so it was this idea of finding a sweet spot, right? And so in some senses, it was based on these different simulations, but it's also based on kind of also developing a metric that made sense to electors, that made sense to legislators in some senses, even though there are nuances around it that are very important with respect to economic size, right? It's something that people kind of understood as a little bit of a baseline. And so I think these two reasons kind of join together so that GDP, a percent spending on defense as a percent of GDP became the metric which was most used. And so that it became adopted as this common metric around 2000. And then we see, of course, the pre-Wales Pledge actually takes place in 2006 among the defense ministers where they informally commit. And then the actual Wales Pledge is in 2014. And so that was a not short history of the history.
I appreciate that background. Many in our audience will already know that your book, Beyond 2%, NATO Partners, Institutions, and Burden Management, argued that there has been an overemphasis on this percent of GDP, this 2% of GDP figure as a synecdoche for a country's readiness to support the NATO alliance. Can you share some of the downsides of focusing specifically on this metric of percentage of GDP spending?
Yes. Well, as I alluded to earlier, it hides the magnitudes of economic size, right? So, a very small country like Lithuania or Latvia can spend 2%, but in a real dollar amount, it's not nearly as much as, for example, one of the major countries in the alliance, right? A Poland, which is now a top 10 spender in the alliance. And so when Trump kind of uses this rhetoric that's like the U.S. pays the most for NATO and everybody else is free riding, it's a little bit, it's false on the edges in the sense that this is a formula that's decided upon. And of course, in fact, Germany and the United States since 2019, and this was actually a Trump bargain, now they paid the same percent. It's exactly equal. And of course, the difference is that the U.S. economy is much larger than Germany's economy. And so if other economies get larger, then of course, these countries would be starting to pay more. But again, you can see how a particular interpretation of the spending really aligns with the rhetoric that, the conservatives want to put forth in the United States. And it's worked because it managed to get countries to spend more.
Are there any alternative ways to look at the way that the burden of collective security can be shared across the alliance?
Yes. And so in my book, one of the things, of course, I was interested in was looking at the various types of metrics that have been used. And so I looked at about 150, actually it was a 210, so 150 articles and 60 or some books, right? Trying to understand what do we actually study when we study burden sharing. We study a lot of different things. That's the first thing I learned. So we study everything from troop contributions to a mission, to money, to kind of contributions of like equipment, and a whole many, many different things. I found that probably about 45% use some version of military spending because, like I said, this is kind of what has been agreed upon, and so it attracts a lot of attention. But then even within using military spending, you have people that use the level, you have people that use the annual change, you have people that use log transformations of that and lags and all of that. So it's not exactly as straightforward as you would think. So one of the other things I did in my book was I actually proposed a couple other metrics of burden sharing. So one of these metrics would essentially be looking at if countries contribute to new operations or missions. Based on this idea, essentially, that countries on a year-to-year basis are, trying to determine how to allocate across various missions, right? It's not just a single NATO mission. Particularly our European partners might have EU missions. There are obviously missions in Africa that various countries are contributing to. So really trying to open this up instead of saying it's not necessarily about NATO, but it's actually about collective security burden sharing, which is many, many different things. And so that's one way in which we're trying to go beyond that. And then another way is essentially thinking a little bit more about qualitative contributions, right? And so this is where Canada always kind of like manages to create this discourse, which is about, middle powermanship and how you kind of like, you don't have to contribute the most, but if you're there in a clutch, if you're there right when you're needed, giving those high level contributions, then maybe you're not really free riding. And so some of it is really kind of looking at some of those nuances, but also we'll say in a larger sense of, what Canada has contributed overall to NATO historically. And so, yeah, it's fascinating to hear. And now, of course, we're opening up a new category of burden sharing with resilience spending. And so that gives us many more things to talk about.
Before turning to the Canadian case specifically, I'd be curious to hear, despite the downsides of the brute measure, the percentage of GDP spending, did your research show why this way of evaluating defense spending is so salient in the political context of the alliance? Is it just because this is a single number that politicians can throw around?
I mean, when I was looking at the historical literature, essentially what I found is that there were a lot of kind of suggestions going around, but essentially the U.S. Congress just like tapped this measure and said in several reports the first one I found in 1997, another in 98, 99, saying this is the burden sharing measure that the alliance uses. The alliance had never said that. But essentially, U.S. Congress said, CRS said, this very influential researcher said, this is the measure. And after that, essentially, I started seeing it being picked up in all of the kind of, and in the Senate and the House of Representatives permanent committees. And then after that, you kind of just see it diffuse. And so again, I would say this is probably a good example of a powerful norm entrepreneur, essentially saying, coming with a little bit of a legitimacy, because you have these reports that are essentially saying, look, we've done simulations on these 10 to dozen economies, and this is what we think is going to work. And we already have the Spanish experience. So this is it. And so I think that it really had to do with that type of momentum. And then, of course, as we know, it's like the power of persuasion. So it got picked up as an informal commitment in 2006 in the defense ministers meeting. And then 8 years later, right, it becomes a formalized commitment and a final communique. So it moves from the defense minister level all the way up to the prime minister, the head of government level. And then, of course, we see it become repeated. So another thing I did was I looked at final communiques from 2014 all the way until 2026. And you literally see it being repeated, particularly it's linked to Article 3. And so one of the things that's interesting is that at least twice Canada was specifically mentioned in final communiques for not being on a path to meet 2%, which I thought was interesting. And so again, I think it also became a way to put pressure on the allies that you're essentially every single year, you're reminding them of this consensus commitment. And that's why for me, it was rather shocking to see successive Trudeau budgets act like the commitment wasn't there. It would not be mentioned. And again, I was looking for it. So I was reading the budgets and it would literally not appear, although it would be appearing in Senate reports and in House reports and in various testimonies and all of that. And so I was like, you could really see this disconnect. Wherein, of course, very different with Carney. He embraced it. He treated it like any good macroeconomist. It was a mathematical formula, and he made it balance. Like I was saying for years, it's not that Canada could not spend the amount. It's that somebody had to literally sit down and say, it is X dollars of money, and how do we do that? And it didn't surprise me at all that Carney did that, because he's simply a guy that understands macroeconomics far better than Trudeau did. And you can see it in the way that he talks about economics and economic forces.
Just to follow up on this point, over the last decade, we've had Canada routinely falling below 2%, routinely not having a plan to reach 2%, aside from select statements at NATO meetings. And now we're talking about 5%. Is this just about a prime minister with a better sense of macroeconomics, or is there something that's changing within the defense team that will allow this 5% to be achieved?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that 2017 Senate report actually laid out a plan. So it wasn't that we had a plan. There was an entire plan that was provided. It plotted out, you need to spend this much. There was a nice curve. There was actually several different curves. And so, it was a lack of political willingness in some senses. And this is pretty clear from the way that Trudeau talked about it. There's a couple, very choice quotes that I've curated where he called it a magical threshold or some noble standard. Those were kind of words that came out of his mouth, which I thought were a little bit ironic, while he was also standing next to people in the family photo, having agreed to a final communique where you would say, like, we're going to get there. And so I think some of it's that. And of course, the other aspect is that, Canada is economically in a far different situation of uncertainty than it was even 2 years ago, right? our largest trade partner has made our trade relationship very difficult. And so this idea, essentially, there's also a link of, being credible on 2% and trying to reduce the level of, harassment we get from the United States for our defense negligence. And now, and I say that because when, Trump issued the executive order that targeted Canada, he used negligent defense spending as one of his reasons. And so for a lot of people that were saying there's no link between these two, I'm constantly pointing back to that, because even though we might not think that there's a link, somebody in Washington does. And that person's the one making policy right now. And so again, it's a little bit of a reckoning and this realization by all the countries in NATO that, Trump is very serious about this, and there's at least three more years of that's going on. But also, we need to plan and align ourselves to meet 5%. And based from what I saw from the budget, which the most recent budget goes out to 2029, the slope of spending that we will be on, the projected spending, will not get us there. And so while this is an intergenerational shift and a resilience budget and very large, we need to continue thinking in large quantities if we actually think that we're going to try to make 2035 5%.
Along that path to 5% and the broader realignment that you pointed to on the budget, how much of that is new spending and how much of that is changing the accounting practices and the move of the Coast Guard into D&D and other recognition of work going on in other government departments?
Yeah. So the shifting of the Coast Guard over to D&D has been a proposal that many of us have made for a while because it aligns with a lot of what our partner militaries do. And so again, it was a little like every single dollar counts. And so why not put those dollars in a pocket where you can have them count in Brussels as well? And so that's great because now we can invest more in the Coast Guard and, we can really do an aspect that's related to our sovereignty, particularly in the North. And so some of it's thinking about that. And so a couple of years ago when I was working on the book, I did some consulting with Global Affairs to really help them open up this pocket. And then they were particularly interested in this idea of the new 1.5 and what that really means in terms of spending. And so the announcement of 1.5 for security resilience related spending really permits Canada to look towards the provinces and municipalities for things that they're already doing. That would be related to, for example, securing critical infrastructure when it comes to energy. There's a number of investments that are already being made. So these types of things will now be eligible to the extent that they would have a defense use or a dual use one way or another. So, for example, creating the Alto train is going to be lots of money, but I'm not sure that you can make it a defense use unless somehow you say if something happens, we're going to be like expropriating it and using it to transport men or material, right? And so again, we have to be careful. Where on the other hand, right, Belgium saying their entire national rail system it has a defense use. That is exactly true because all of the equipment that has come from Northern Europe and gone through Ukraine has gone on Belgian rails, something like 75 or 85% of the equipment. And the trains still run on time in Belgium, right? We can't even get trains on time in Canada. And so, I think that there are lots of opportunities. There are ways in which we can think about how this investment can work, for example, with respect to Arctic development, Arctic infrastructure development. It would, fit the needs that we have for greater Arctic presence, while also kind of being able maybe to create a presence so that we could, for example, host Nordic partner naval assets in the region. Maybe we want to create Arctic development so that there are defense development research centers. And so all of these lovely firms that we want to create these links with in Europe, now we say, hey, come to the Arctic of Canada and test your equipment here, right? Maybe these are the things we should be thinking of. And so I hope that not only they're being as creative as I can try to be just in my living room, thinking about this, because this really it's about opportunities and aligning, but also, I think the other part we're not thinking about is that this also has to work for the next generation. And so you and I working at universities, this is the other thing that I'm also a little bit obsessed with, is how to make this trickle down to well-paying stages and well-paying internships and future employment for students that we are now training, because that's also how we make this become a self-reinforcing cycle.
It's definitely becoming a more complex policy area where we're not just looking at, a defense policy update and then isolated announcements, but we're going to see a far greater attention to integration in transatlantic projects, the defense industrial strategy, whenever this comes to pass, and then also the integration with provincial governments that we haven't seen historically.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, the defense industrial strategy will be giving us the ways and identifying some of the means. Because right now we have a very broadly mandated, a defense investment agency, which has been created, which is going to be really, working on the procurement aspects. But again, it's a new institution, right? And so it's going to need to have some very strong guidance. And so, but at the other hand, we need to make sure we guide it, but don't put our hand too heavily upon it, because the problem with our old procurement agency was that we had too many hands upon it and too many guidances and too much oversight, right? And so I think we're all interested to see exactly what this looks like. And this year, I mean, if the spending is supposed to be as projected, we should have at least a major announcement on submarines in 2026, because we've got a pocket of money going that direction. And so that's really the next thing, the next major procurement that I think we're all kind of anxiously awaiting. We want a strategy, and we want to know, whether or not it's going to be, dim sum or schnitzel.
This steps into the next question that I had for you, and that's around, what are the storylines that we're watching? So domestically, the defense industrial strategy, the submarine procurement. Perhaps if you could touch on that both here in Canada and across the alliance, as we gear up for another summit this summer.
Yes.
What are the storylines that listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I mean, in terms of thinking about the summer, I think, one of the storylines that I think that they should be caring about is, having worked a little bit on Baltic air policing, this is a mission that I think needs to be reconsidered. Because we now have Eastern Century, it's a little bit of evidence that Baltic air policing is not working, because we've had to put a separate mission in, which has air and maritime aspects, which is essentially in the same space. And so I think that this is something, and this is important because it's the eastern flank, and this is where we're getting a lot of pressure in the alliance. And so it's not efficient to be running multiple missions and dividing the assets in the way that we are. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing is the following. So last I knew, and I haven't followed it, but all of the presences should be entirely built up in the battle groups in the eastern flank. And so some of them were behind in terms of getting the equipment and the personnel there. So the schedule got behind. And so that means that all of the certifications for all of the interoperable integration also got behind. And so again, I'm going to be watching to ensure that those things kind of try to move back into schedule, right? There was a little bit of, mostly some of the issues were coming from the Danes and the British, which is ironic because they're a little bit closer than the Canadians, and we managed to get our game, get everything together transatlantically. And so those are other issues. And then, of course, I think that we're all a little bit, our eyes are open. We're trying to figure out what's the next, how NATO should be thinking and reflecting upon, the southern cone of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. has been operating in various ways in that region. And I think that NATO, this is definitely an area where discussions need to be occurring. because, unfettered U.S. Maritime security activity, which has a thin veil of international law, should concern NATO partners and allies, particularly because the region of South America, and particularly the Southern Cone, there's a lot of Russian and Chinese influence there. And so this is it's creating multiple kind of tensions at the same time. And all of those things would have repercussions, particularly for Canada, because frankly, we would be looked at as one of the countries to be assisting and, doing something because we're close. And so Ottawa has had quite a disinterest in, obviously for strategic reasons, because we have a difficult relationship with the United States right now. But I don't think that we can continue to play the ostrich very long if this continues to get more and more difficult. And I don't think NATO can either. And so that's another thing that I think that will eventually, I don't know what discussions those will look like. But again, I think a lot of people are saying there are multiple tensions in the alliance. Kind of, I often talk about these kind of centripetal and centrifugal forces. And right now, we're having a lot of centrifugal forces that are trying to pull everybody apart. Ukraine tended to be a centripetal force. We got a lot of people back into the alliance. We got a lot of partners that were kind of on the edges back into the alliance. People, countries took, for example, we saw short-term investment in Baltic air policing, right? We saw the increasing of the brigade groups to, the brigades to battle groups. But now, it's like as the crisis and Russia's war of aggression continues in Ukraine, we can see things starting to relax a little bit and these forces pulling the alliance apart. And so it's going to be really important, particularly because the summer is being hosted in Turkey. And Turkey is, a partner that has not always felt centrally welcomed in the alliance. And so this is also a moment to kind of, take stock and, really see how this dynamic works. And I think Canada, definitely wants to position itself in a role as trying to often, wanting to self-position itself as a little bit of a bridge between the difficult clicks in the alliance, right? Like with 32 partners, I don't want to say it's like Mean Girls in high school, but there are some cliques, there are some little groups. And it's when countries feel isolated out of a group like Turkey does, it can be very difficult for them to continue to feel part of unity. And what is interesting about Canada is that we've always been kind of geographically and we've always kind of self-identity isolated ourselves, but managed to always find ourselves back in the community, right? And so I think Canada has something to add here in some senses, right? Saying like, yeah, look, like we're also a little marginalized. We're also a little beat up on because, all of the things that are going on, but we still don't give up. And I think that that's also part of, what, Canada's role is in this alliance.
And given all of the tension and the potential increase to that complexity, do you think observers should see the best possible outcome as a boring summit?
Well, I don't think the summit's going to be boring. I think a better possible outcome would be a summit that's more informative. I think what shocked everybody about the last summit was how little ever the countries agreed upon. For, like I say, somebody who studied summit final communiques, some communiques were over 150 points. Last year's summit communique wasn't even 10 points. And so it really showed how little they could agree upon to actually put into text in the agreement. So I think a summit where they would be able to have language that's stronger with respect to Russia. Some of these things would be a little bit, but it's also going to, I say it's also going to depend a little bit on the political winds in Washington. If Trump feels like his feelings has been hurt and he does a little, a toddler crisis, maybe Trump decides not to go or he sends somebody else, right? in those instances, I say it's double-edged, right? Because maybe you can get more done without a Trump in the room, but then you might also have a Trump who essentially just, denies and fails to go along with everything once his delegate gets back to Washington. And so it's a little bit like, when you have to collaborate with an actor like Trump currently, the uncertainty is really going to drive risk-averse behavior. We're going to see, the bland, not informative outcomes. And I think if that's, if a non-crisis, I guess, is the outcome that is the minimal acceptable, then I guess that's, what we're cheering for, seeing as we're having so many crises provoked by one individual recently.
Well, with so much uncertainty and crisis out there in the world, we really appreciate that you took a bit of your time to join us today on the podcast on defense and security, laying out some important issues that we should continue following on the NATO and defense spending files, and also offering some background to make sure that all of our listeners are up to speed on these critical issue areas. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.